All right. Well, Eliza, thank you so much for joining us today. I was reviewing your LinkedIn, like I was sharing just before the call, and so impressed with your background, having worked at TD Ameritrade and then also at Moss Adams and holding a number of consulting roles. And then now, I mean, you've consulted with hundreds of financial advisors and continuing to do so. And firms, I should really say. So I'd love to hear. Well, we'll start there. I just love to hear, how did you get started in really your consulting practice and launching it independent of working with some really big names? So,
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for having me along. I always describe it as a very long path to get to this point. But I think there are probably a few defining moments in anyone's career you can point to that kind of got you where you are today in terms of, founding a firm. But, my career in consulting in the US really started with Moss Adams back in 2006, around that time, where I was recruited and moved to Seattle from Western Australia, worked alongside Mark DeBergen, which was a fantastic experience. That team was wonderful to work with.
mm,
And then the financial crisis hit. As many people know, Moss Adams kind of closed up their consulting group at that time. And I co-founded FA Insight with Dan Inveen, which was a research and consulting firm that exclusively served the US financial services industry. And Dan and I produced a wealth of research together and consulted with institutions as well as larger advisory firms. And we
mhm.
had a great run for many years. And then we were acquired by TD Ameritrade back in 2016, who was actually our biggest client at the time. And actually, we stayed on with TD Ameritrade. Dan and I both did a lot of work with them, building more research,
Mm.
producing their practice management programs, white papers, guidebooks, all sorts of tools for advisors. So, it wasn't until the Schwab acquisition of TD that I decided to go out on my own and now De Pardo Consulting and working independently.
Fantastic, which is not an
It's a kind
easy
of a long
journey.
path.
Yes, but came with such great experience and connections and all of that. So, consulting can go so many different directions. I know, just sort of looking under the hood, right? From business strategy, practice management, a variety of things. And for your firm, what are you really focused on, or what are themes that come out of your consulting work and talking with different firms?
Well, at the moment, I would say that the majority of the consulting work in particular is focused on human capital management. We have
Mhm.
an area of expertise here. We've done that for many years, but there are so many factors in the marketplace that are creating human capital challenges for advisory firms at the moment that tends to be where we're engaged. Areas like organizational design, compensation planning, performance management,
Mm.
and all the human capital issues kind of associated with those buckets, if you like, where folks need help generally.
Mhm.
And then we do a lot of work in strategic growth and really supporting firms, larger firms in understanding or coming together around a growth strategy and being able
Mm.
to execute on that strategy. So that's from a consulting perspective. And from a research perspective, we like to really cover all areas in the market. And I've found that over my career in consulting that the more depth of data you can have available to you to consult, the better that is, and the more consulting experience you have to feed into the research, the better that is for the research. So,
Yes,
those two elements are really important to work together. But
absolutely.
generally, I would say, human capital is probably the one area that really firms are most challenged right now.
Mhm. And can you share a little bit more about that? I mean, it's sort of an interesting time, right? I feel like I've seen a lot of firms that are going through M&A activity, or they're trying to hire and find that right culture fit
Yeah.
or the right growth structure. And, what sort of obstacles are you seeing with firms as they are trying to grow, or is it just a
Mm.
sort of like boom of growth? Sort of what patterns are you seeing?
Well, this year in particular has been a rough year for advisory firms. The markets have been very uncooperative for the typical firm. And I
Hmm.
think most firms are going to be down in terms of revenue this year. But in addition to that, the acute talent shortage in our industry is probably one of the most significant challenges for firms in terms of being able to sustain rates of growth. If you could imagine the sort of disruption it causes in a business when you lose somebody, a talented team member that leaves the business, that becomes harder to replace. It might take you 6 months or longer to find the right fit to replace that individual. and you've got this kind of gaping hole in the firm for a period of time. And if you experience more than one departure, and this is kind of common at the moment, many firms are sort of struggling a little bit with the retention of talent. This will over time make it harder and harder to sustain rates of growth. And certainly if you're losing talent in the area of business development, client acquisition, of course, the impact is felt even more significantly. So the acute talent shortage is a challenge. If we combine that with economy-wide impacts, like very low unemployment right now, very high inflation, all of these things are combining, including, what we experienced last year, which was this concept of the Great Resignation back in August, which kind of hit its peak. All of these things are combining to make it extra difficult for firms to grow their pool of talent in a really sustainable way. So I think firms have to be really focused on how they're going to develop talent internally, and perhaps change their approach to recruitment to do perhaps have more luck in terms of getting the right people into the business.
Yeah, we see it too. I mean, well, there's, like you said, the Great Resignation, right? Which is a nationwide trend was happening. But I feel like in this industry, regardless, it's really hard to hire the right value set, and the importance of the hire is so critical, right? Because it's that client relationship, and then holding on to that client relationship for quite some time. It's relationship first business, right? So it's not just, okay, check. Have you got these credentials, but also have you is there a value set there, and a reflection of how the firm is looking to present themselves out, outwardly. So
yeah, it's very true. And I think firms are extra cautious whenever they're recruiting roles that will be really close to the client relationships. They do have to meet firm cultural values. They have to be really in alignment with the way the partners are running the firm to be a good fit for clients and for the business. So it takes a little bit more effort to try and figure that out when you're recruiting. But I think it's worthwhile taking a little extra time to make sure that those decisions are on point, because of course any errors made can be kind of just an ongoing, you don't want that ongoing turnover of talent as we make recruitment missteps, if you like. And oftentimes, as you know, I've met firms over the years where their retention of talent has been a real problem. Oftentimes it comes back to their recruitment efforts and how well or not so well they're going through the recruitment process. And in some cases, they're finding they're getting higher rates of turnover because they're not doing such a good job up front.
That's fair. So I have to ask you, it has been a weird year, right, with the markets and coming off of COVID and all of those sorts of things. And as we're going into the new year, if you were to give one piece of advice, especially to C-suite ownership, about the look ahead around, human capital management, what would be that nugget of advice that you would give them that you feel like would set them ahead?
I think as it relates to the growth of talent, I think you've got to invest heavily in your own development pipeline, if you like. So creating a career path, showing talent what the future could look like for them in the business, but then investing really heavily in the development of talent, whether that's internal training, role shadowing, mentoring, or engaging external trainers to be able to support the development of your staff. I think it's incredibly important. Given how hard it is to recruit, given how hard it is to retain talent, I do think firms really have to focus heavily themselves on building development programs. But related to that, we're going into performance review time for the end of the year for 2022, and many firm owners and executives are going to start having conversations around compensation. And I do think that being extra prepared this year for what will be challenging conversations around pay is important if you want to make sure team members feel valued and we're not rocking the boat and there are no surprises, nasty surprises for anybody. I think you've got to be extra prepared for your compensation conversations this year.
Yep, that's absolutely fair. And that's really good advice too, because you're right, it's a very competitive market right now. And it's easy to be able to, have shiny objects with big numbers, but doesn't necessarily mean it's the right culture fit too. They plucking teammates, right? So Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great
Yeah.
advice. So, um, just, learning a little bit more about kind of the ethos that you're leading with too. It sounds like there's a lot around positive change and how do you handle that when things aren't so positive, or are there things that you try to really lead forward with so that when you come into working with a firm that it might be an X state, but how do you get them sort of to that next state so that it is forward leaning versus just cyclical? So
Yeah, I think whenever a firm engages any external consultant to come in and help solve challenges, you have to be really honest with them about the kind of effort it takes to be able to drive change in a firm. The firms that I've worked with over the years that have really excelled in the implementation of change are those businesses that have really strong leadership who take a very keen interest
mhm,
in the initiatives that you're working on.
mhm,
And they do a really great job of communicating regularly with the team. They also have the capacity to be able to do the work that's required to implement the implement the change. So, for example, if you undergo a kind of a piece of business and are trying to transform parts of the business, you don't really have the capacity to manage that actively every week, week on week. And it could be easily an 18-month change program, if you like, in some cases. You're simply
right,
not going to make any headway.
right.
So I really encourage firms to engage with to understand the effort that's required to drive the change consistently,
Mhm.
making sure they have capacity, making sure that they're assigning the right skills to the
Yep,
projects,
yep.
and that they've really also got the appetite and the enthusiasm for it. That goes an awful long way.
Yeah.
That's definitely, when I look back at those clients who do really, really well in implementing change, they tend to have executives who have the capacity, who have the capabilities, and who really have the enthusiasm for the work.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting here you frame it that way. So from a marketing perspective, we're always mapping the marketing directly to the business strategy, right? Where do we want to go? And then how are we going to map that in? But it's really easy
Sure.
to kind of,
Yeah.
I think especially for C-suite, right? They can see the vision and it's easy to talk about the vision and
Mm.
wanting it now, but then how do you layer that in so that it's the change is managed appropriately? And I'd just be curious when you're going into an engagement, because I'm sure that there's an umbrella of activity. Are you then timelining that and basically project planning those various initiatives based off of where the firm is at? Kind of what does that look like so that you can
Yeah.
work towards that positive direction of what the outcome is and a expectation, like having clear expectations going into it, right? That it's not just going to be sort of snap your fingers and it's all flowers and
Yeah.
butterflies. So yeah.
Well, oftentimes that's how strategic planning feels for firms. As you go through that process, it's creative. The management and executives love to be involved in it because it opens a door to some great discussion, and they're generally pretty excited about where they land in terms of designing the strategy, which is wonderful. But it's kind of like a suntan, like it can wear off unless you've got to keep the momentum going, right? So um, we do work with firms in the implementation planning, and for some clients, not all, it depends on the firm and their needs, but we will develop what we call a very detailed implementation schedule, which takes, for example, the firm's strategy for the next 12 months and breaks it down into very detailed actions, and we assign accountabilities and we set timeframes, and then we'll manage that for a 12-month period, in some cases up to 2 years, to try to ensure that all of the project teams within the firm are staying on track,
Mhm.
and the working groups are getting their stuff done. And we'll meet on a regular basis to make sure that that's happening and provide coaching in the development of solutions along the way. Some firms, however, feel quite equipped to do that themselves, which is great. Others prefer to have more guidance in that area. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of how we work with clients to support implementation.
Yep.
Does that
So
answer your question, Lauren?
yeah, it does. And I mean, I can feel it on this end too, because it's not at the company-wide sort of operations level, right? But for us, I mean, if we're, for example, rolling out a new positioning or branding or what have you, it's a culture shift. And that does
Mm.
not happen overnight. You can put something up, kind of like if you're to put up a website, but if no one knows about it, it takes time to build that up. If you're to put out a new brand, people have to know about it in order to really for it to take flight. And it takes adjustments and it doesn't happen over time. And I'm sure it's similar to your work. And it's just, we're just a little bit of a smaller degree because marketing sits underneath strategy, business strategy. So um,
You're spot on. It's that communication piece that's so essential. If you've got leaders in the business that are communicating openly, regularly, with their broader team, you're much more likely to be successful in implementing the change. If no one knows about it and it's all happening amongst a small group of people, then we expect change to happen. It's just kind of unrealistic.
It is, and having that in the leadership to believe in the change and then, to have those internal champions to help drive it. So, um, I'd love to hear too,
Yeah.
since you've had access to the C-suite at so many different levels, I'm sure of a variety of sizes of firms and what's going on. Is there anything in particular at where we are and in the world right now, or what you see ahead that just gets you fired up, that feels different or feels like I don't know if it's a disruption or a trend or what have you that I think is an exciting potential change for this industry too.
Um, there's nothing that comes to mind in terms of any major disruption. I mean, some of the better firms that I'm working with, who are, when I say better firms, they're all strong firms, but some of them tend to be more aggressive in their approach. I think the technology that's available to firms in the marketplace is just evolving so rapidly that there is more of an opportunity for firms to build a tech stack that's going to better shape their business model in the future. I think I'm finding certainly over the years that I'm meeting with executives that are just becoming more and more savvy, more and more capable. Advisory teams are doing a better job of deepening their expertise across a range of management capabilities. And that for our industry is somewhat of an evolution. We've moved from an industry which has been very fragmented, in that we've had thousands and thousands of very small players that over the course of time have started to come together. And we've seen record numbers of merger and acquisition activity in recent years as firms are folding into each other. And we're creating these entities that are growing in scale relative to what we've seen historically. And with that comes deeper levels of capability, deeper pockets, but also deeper expertise and executive teams that are leading their businesses in very different ways to what we've seen in the past. I think the level of management expertise is becoming far more seasoned and very, very rich and deep. And some firms really have extraordinary capabilities in this space, and that's an exciting time. I do think there's a lot of wonderful benefits that come from the level of M&A activity that we're seeing in the marketplace, and in some cases I do really feel like it's leading to much deeper expertise and greater professionalization within the industry.
Yeah, I agree. I'm seeing that too. And it creates, especially for some of these uh, bigger firms, that deeper expertise or in-house knowledge is something that wasn't always there. So to be able to see that is it could shape and really change the service offering at large potentially. So um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the clients are ultimately the beneficiaries of that.
mhm.
That these firms that are creating scale and have really strong, dedicated management, strong advice team structures, are able to deliver a much more advanced client experience for their end clients, perhaps relative to what firms can do otherwise.
Yeah, agree. Robust experience and just team of deep knowledge, and to be able to have that kind of expertise at your fingertips, it's integrated, is something that I feel like was only for kind of the bigger companies of the day, and now it's still bigger in general, but is changing things. So um, fantastic. Anything else you think would be helpful to share as we look ahead with the work that you're doing or the research or conversations?
Well, one of the things that I think is really, I kind of alluded to it before, in terms of firms going into performance review season now towards the end of 2022 and dealing with economy-wide impacts like inflation, compensation is going to be a really huge challenge for firms this year and next year. Mm-hmm. Revenue is likely to be down. Expenses as a share of revenue will be up. So, I think there's real merit in thinking through your strategy around compensation, but in particular cost of living adjustments, the use of incentive compensation to adjust pay, perhaps as an alternative to cost of living adjustments. I think if firms are going down that path, they need to tread very carefully around making increases that are associated or connected directly with inflation to protect their financials going forward. So, to me, this is going to be one of the really red hot issues that firms are going to have to contend with in this current environment. Team members, I think across our industry, but more broadly in the economy, people are going to be looking to their managers, business owners, and executives to address the pressures that they're feeling from an inflationary perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's upon owners and managers to have a very clear view on how they're going to handle it, to be able to have the right messaging, to be able to ensure team members feel comfortable and taken care of during these really difficult times, and to avoid a situation where we create disappointment and departures potentially with talent. So, I counsel firms in particular to be very careful around the use of cost of living adjustments. If you're going to do it this year, use them very carefully, be very clear with team members that cost of living adjustments are not going to take place every year. It might be very much a one-off, and firms should be really cautious in how much they offer up this year in particular, just to make sure we're controlling fixed costs, given all the other pressures on revenue generation this year.
Yeah,
that's probably my key kind of round out 2022.
Yeah, that's really good advice, especially with, we finished one political season, at least here in the US, but more of that will come, and markets up and down. And so it's great advice. And we appreciate that you sharing a little bit of what you're seeing inside of the C-suite and some of those conversations. So,
yeah,
but appreciate your time, and thank you so much for all the work that you do and for supporting so many firms and giving some of those tips, especially as we look ahead for the new year. So thank you again.